Hi everybody, this is Matthew Poes of Poes Acoustics, and in this video, I'm going to be talking about video. I'm going to be talking about viewing angles and brightness requirements because I think that there have been shifts. I've mentioned this too, that there's been shifts in what's necessary, but what people understand hasn't changed. And so what you all, when you even talk to integrators who are not informed on this, or you come to me, your expectations around how bright a projector should be is actually well below what it really needs to be. And your expectations about what the viewing angles should be are also well below what they really should be today. So I'm going to share my screen and show you a piece of software that allows us to visualize what we're talking about a little bit. We're going to go through some calculations using some actual projectors and talk about how the foot lamberts we get on those screens for that given screen area translates into brightness levels and how that looks for HDR. And that's really the focus for this. So I'm going to go ahead and add this so you can see it. So something to keep in mind. So what I've done is created a room that's roughly the size of my room. I've put in one row of seats because that's all we're going to do for this. It's just easier to think in those terms. And we're going to look at the different viewing angles. And I'm actually probably going to cover a few things just because it's worth covering them. So the first thing is I've kind of pre-populated this to show you where it should be at. I've put the seat farther back than it actually is in my room, but I've put it at a distance that I think is a good distance for sound quality because it's pushed back enough that you're actually going to get a nice room sound out of it. You can spread the speakers fairly well. If we do this, you can see that if we use 100, now remember in proper home theater engineering, we do not talk about screens in terms of diagonal. We talk about them in terms of width. The diagonal concept comes from TVs and is unrelated to how we think in rooms. So 140 inches is the width, not the diagonal. The screen would be, I don't know what the diagonal would be, wider than that. So this is a 16:9 screen. You can see that with this just about 10-foot ceiling height, we've got quite a bit of the height covered. And this can actually create some problems sometimes where we end up having to push the screen too far up in order to give some space underneath. But this actually works pretty well like this. And we can look at this right here, this dotted line, that shows the upward angle of the head. And we want to make sure that that upward angle is relatively flat or just a little elevated. The higher that gets, the more uncomfortable it is to watch. Having said that, if you are reclining, that upward angle actually becomes a benefit. And so pushing the screen height up can be beneficial if you know you're always going to watch movies reclined. But you do have to understand how reclined they are because, again, this can become a ergonomics problem. I actually call that the ergonomic analysis. It's something we do when we design rooms. And we look at the different scenarios and we talk to you. And we basically try to figure out, well, how do you use the room? Are you always going to recline or not? I actually tend to, when I really like movies, I literally sit on the edge of my seat. It's kind of silly. I was watching a movie one day and realized I was doing that. It was Gran Turismo. And I don't know what it was about that movie, but like I just got really into it. And I found myself like there was so much action and I'm sitting on the edge of my seat, like looking what's going to happen, and then realized what I was doing and how different that is from people who design rooms for the opposite where you're laying back. So my screen needs to actually sit with a fairly flat viewing angle because I only recline if I'm just tired and not really paying attention. All right. So I chose 140 inches for this. It gets us right around 51 degrees. So SMPTE's recommendations are actually old. I want you to remember that. And the TH recommendations are also old. That was based on 2K non-HDR content. And it was based on what made sense at that time. We've gone past that now, and we are revisiting these ideas. We are now at 4K. We are probably going to move into 8K in the not so distant future. That higher resolution means you can actually sit closer without seeing any sort of grid. So then you might say, well, what's the expected viewing angles that the directors want us to see? Well, we actually had conversations with these guys and people who work with them. And what we found out was that the creatives do not have a particular viewing angle in mind for home content. It's just not even on their radar. They do have particular viewing angles in mind for cinemas, but they base it on options. Some of them will actually sit very close in screening rooms, excuse me, so that their viewing angle is quite high, probably more like 60 degrees. Some of them even sit as close as 80 degrees. Had to drink something to address that coughing. Some of them will sit farther back. So when you talk about that, when we have conversations about what you would expect in commercial cinemas, we give a range instead of a specific number. And we basically say anything from, call it 70 degrees to 40 degrees would all be considered good optimal viewing angles, depending on what you're looking for. And it's really a personal thing. But in rooms, we have to pick a number because there's only one RSP. And so the number we tend to shoot for now with this new content is going to fall somewhere between 50 and 60 degrees. It's still not a single number. It's hard to do that. I tend to try to target around 52 to 57 degrees. I think that that's a good angle range that I like. If you get a little bit closer to that, into the 60-degree angle range, that becomes a very immersive experience. And some films I find to be a bit overwhelming. Some of this, I would also say, it differs between 16:9 and scope. I think 50 to 52 degrees for a horizontal viewing angle makes sense for 16:9 content because actually it's the vertical angle that matters. Need to drink again. The horizontal field of view is a different story, and you can widen it and have it still be comfortable if that's what you're trying to do. I just had a conversation. I'm like telling you guys all this and then realizing there's all these exceptions. I just had a conversation with Chris Seymour from Seymour Screen Excellence and Seymour AV. And he was telling me that actually some of the films that change aspect ratios were doing this IMAX thing, as he put it, where when the action gets intense, that's when they switch to 16:9, not scope. So the old idea had always been that 16:9 was more for intimate scenes and scope was more for like the big real world drama scenes, like watching a film, like watching a battle take place from a distance, you would use scope. And they were trying to fill your whole horizontal field of view and then some. Apparently some directors more recently have actually kind of turned the opposite, and they're trying to create like an overwhelming image where the vertical is actually quite overwhelming. So I suppose a better way to look at this, rather than to say you can go wider, would be what kind of movies do you watch and what kind of immersiveness are you looking for? If you're looking for that really overwhelming image, a 16:9 screen that's quite large may in fact make quite a bit of sense. So anyway, we've got our horizontal field of view. We've got our vertical here at 30 degrees. You'll see that if I switch this to a scope screen, which we can do over here, this drops to 23 degrees, but this is 51 degrees. I would argue that 23 is maybe a little on the lower end, but like 20, call it 20 to 30 degrees in that range, I think is totally fine for a vertical viewing angle. I do think that when you get past 30 degrees in the vertical, it gets a little overwhelming. It's not my preference, but I could totally see people doing that. So we're going to go back to 16:9 though, and we're at 140 inches wide. So then we have an issue. How bright does this need to be to look right? Well, in the old days when we were dealing with SDR content, you really could get away with something that was in the neighborhood of, call it 40 to 60 nits. That was okay. And so if you were doing 40 to 60 nits, it tended to look bright and punchy and the image was good. And actually what tended to really dominate your perception of the quality was the color and the black levels. As long as you had nice dark black levels, good contrast, you were hitting those nit levels and the color was good, it looked good. And then HDR came out and that really changed things. And projectors, the better thing to say was they simply can't reproduce HDR, and certainly in the past, not even close. But we've moved on to a point where it's possible to have extended dynamic range EDR or true HDR with projectors with some caveats. And what I have found and others have found in watching content on these projectors in this way is that modern HDR content really does look better as long as you're using dynamic tone mapping that's brighter. If it's now, you need dynamic tone mapping regardless. In fact, the dimmer it goes, the more important dynamic tone mapping is. But the problem is if it's too dim, the dynamic tone mapping can help to reduce some of the black crush. But overall, it's just not going to look good. You're not going to get the highlights you need. So the old thinking was getting people to basically do the wrong projectors. So my go-tos have always been JVC. I love them. And I still think that they're a great projector when you are in that price point and your screen size isn't too large. But here's a pretty typical sized room. So this room is a little under 19. It's basically 19 feet by 16 and a half feet by 10 feet, right? So that's how we've done it. We've got the seats pretty optimized for good sound. And we've put a screen in there to give us a 51-degree horizontal viewing angle. So we're going to go over to Projector Central where I've already loaded a JVC DLA NZ900. I know a lot of you guys like to do this, so I'm going to go ahead and we're going to push it all the way up because you get some extra brightness out of it. And we're going to change this to 16.9. And we're going to change this to the 140 number that we've been using for width, remember? So we're at 140 for width. And then change, there we go. 140 for width, which puts it at 15 feet, 10 inches, which, if you recall, the room was, is this really right? Holy cow, yep. The room was 19 feet, so it would be about 3.5 feet roughly into the room. And we're at 33 foot Lamberts. So let's go over to this converter here and see, what does 33 foot Lamberts put us at? And the answer is 113 nits. So I would call this projector marginal. We've already got 0.9 gain in there. We might even switch it down to 0.8. And that actually takes us down to 29. We are using Projector Central's estimate, which is probably smart because we actually need to be down from what the projector's rated at. It doesn't really do that when you're doing proper DCI P3 color, full color optimization. So it's putting us at right around 100 nits. And it's about what we get on screens of this size. And so I would say that that is marginal. It falls into the category of HDR looking better than it used to when projectors weren't as bright as this one, but nowhere near what it should be for proper HDR. And if the screen has to get any bigger than this, we're going to have a problem. So in larger rooms where we're trying to maintain that angle, we often get into situations where the projector screen needs to be, a common one I've run into recently a bunch of times is 185 inches. So we're going to go ahead and do that. So now we're at 185 inches. And at 185 inches, we're looking at 17 foot Lamberts. Well, that's not going to cut it. Look at this. We're only looking at 58 nits. That's SDR. That is firmly in the SDR arena. So we now need to look at a different projector. So what can we look at? Well, let's look at the, I think it's called the M. So I'm doing this wrong. So we'll look at the Christie because it's a oops, space 4K. No, I didn't do that right. All right, let's go ahead and just find it. It's easier. Christie. All right, where are you? M4K series. Here we go. And we're going to do this one right here. So we've got the standard M4K 15 projector. We are going to pick a lens that actually makes sense for this. So something like probably this one. One of these is going to be the most commonly used lens we would have. And we are going to make this now a more normal size. So we were looking at 185 inch width because I was telling you before that that was a common size that I had to deal with. I mean, we can do this if you want, but you can see we now have a lot more to deal with and it doesn't really matter. Let's go ahead and keep it all similar. Same thing. This projector is not going to put out 15,000 lumens, so we're going to let them use their little derating estimate here because you can see it goes to 84 versus 81. It's a little less bright. Let's put in 81. What happens? Where are we at? So we're at 277 nits, which is really, really bright. This is still a little shy of the new HDR standard that was adopted by DCI, which is 300 nits. And I think that's okay. So I tend to argue, and I just heard a couple other people echo the same thing. My friend Sammy, who does reviews for Projector Central, has said this number. Ben Goff has said this number. He's a friend of mine as well. And so they both feel like 150 nits is sort of the magic number where we can start to call that HDR, where it looks good enough. It's not as good as this, but the punchiness goes way up. So you can see with the M4K 15, we're able to basically double that. I mean, we can definitely get to 150 nits and then some. In fact, to go back to the optimal screen size for my room, 140, once we go to that and we place this where it needs to be placed, because that actually wouldn't work in my room given how noisy it is. We're going to push it all the way back. We're at 127 foot Lamberts. We're like way, way bright. We could turn that laser down. We will turn that laser down because at this point, look at this, 435 nits. And in fact, that's kind of what we were seeing in my room. And so we turned the laser down, I think, to like 60 or 65% because we just didn't, you don't need that. There are some people who like that. They think it looks great. The problem with it, the reason why you don't necessarily want to push it that bright is that the blacks do go up. And so even though the highlights are going up, the blacks are going up too. But you tend to pay more attention and notice the blacks going up more than you're going to notice the whites going up. So there's an argument to be made to turning this down a little bit and finding a balance where it's bright enough that the HDR really looks good and those highlights really pop. And at the same time, the blacks are not distracting. Personally, I've not seen 400 or 500 nits in a way that I thought looked great because of the effect it has on blacks, and have preferred a darker image. I would be interested, I'm just going to bring this up. Alex Evans, who's a friend of mine, he has the new Eclipse projector in the new Gen 3, and you'll see we're going to do some videos and talk about it. There is nothing like it on the market. And it'll do, I think he said it's 24 million to 1 contrast. It's black. It like does true black. Because of that, he can get, I don't think he can get to 435 nits, but he can get over 300 nits when that thing is running at full brightness, I believe, and may be able to get up to 400. And with true black, it'll be really interesting to see what that looks like. I'll see if I can talk him into actually maybe creating some presets so that we can look at call it 250 or 300 nits, maybe 300 nits would be the number to use. And then the higher one, the 400 nits, and see how content compares when the black floor isn't actually going up and down like you typically see with DLP projectors. But the point I'm trying to make to you guys is that depending on the size of your screen, the standard projectors we typically use are not really capable of producing the brightness we need them to produce in order to create what I would call a true HDR looking image. Now, all of these images are going to need tone mapping. There's no denying that. But what you're going to find is that the amount of tone mapping and the effect that it has is going to be a lot less with those brighter images. And so when you've got a 300 nit image and you still have acceptable blacks, you're going to find that dynamic tone mapping makes a benefit and it's noticeable, but the image still looks good and natural. When you've only got 100 nits, the dynamic tone mapping, again, is still really important, but it's also going to create some artifacts that don't look great. Drop it even farther down where you're trying to light up that 185-inch screen that I showed you before, but where we're only really getting, what did we say it was, like 50 or 60 nits. At that, I think it was 60 nits. At that point, what happens when the dynamic tone mapping starts to try to make things look right is that those dark scenes, those like cave scenes, actually look like somebody turned the gamma curve up way incorrectly and that it looks awful. I don't like the look of that personally, even though it's actually fixing some of the black crush problems and the loss of details. Really what you're seeing is a artifact of just not having anywhere near enough lumens to create good PQ tracking with the content. So in my opinion, that's not the better way to do it. And I didn't used to be on board with this. I mean, I talked about this in another video. My old view on all of this was actually something very different. I thought that having better black levels was ultimately going to be much, much more important than having brighter whites, and that would create a better looking HDR image. And I think two things happened, and it's kind of hard to separate them because currently none of the Sony, JVC, or Epson projectors can produce a significant portion of Rec 2020. They don't even really produce 100% of DCI-P3 color at this point in time. And to get the extra brightness out of them, you actually have to get rid of the cinema filters that give you that high percentage of DCI-P3. So having now been exposed repeatedly in my projects and in my own viewing experience to what like 90% plus of Rec 2020 looks like, it just looks spectacular. I found that to be way more important than I ever thought it would have been. But then added on to that, most of the projectors that are able to do that are actually all of them are tri-laser projectors. And so in addition to having higher color purity and as a result, wider color gamut coverage, they also tend to have higher brightness. And that higher brightness is leading to HDR that pops more. The review will come out soon. I recently finished a review of the Valerian projector that's been getting rave reviews. And one of the things I noted about it was that because it's using a tri-laser and it's about 92% of Rec 2020 coverage, that color coverage is giving it the ability to have that same brilliance, color brilliance that you see on films that make use of it. And it looks really good. But then it also happens to be a bit brighter than most projectors, especially in its price range. And so it tends to create HDR images that pop a little bit better. My screen is fairly small. It's only 114 inches wide, I believe. And so that creates an image where the high-end JVC, this Valerian, they're not as bright as I'd like them to be, but they're bright enough to be pretty good. So we can actually put that back in. So we can do the NZ900. And if we switch this down to 16:9, 114 inches, And in my case, actually it's pretty close to the throw distance, I think. Yeah, I'll just leave it there. And my screen is a little bit higher. So 43 foot Lamberts, which is 147 nits. Again, on screens of that size, we've seen numbers in that range. I think we've seen anywhere from between 120 and 150 after calibration. I don't know why it's varied much at all, but it does seem to vary a little bit. But if we go back over to here and we change the screen size to 114 inches, you do have to, so we have to do a custom one for that. So we will do that. Now we have the 114. We can see it's 43 degrees at this viewing distance. This is not my viewing distance, so I'm going to open this up so that I can bring it closer. My viewing distance is actually about, I'm trying to remember now, about 10 feet, so about 120 inches or so. Oh, didn't do that quite right. It's like, yeah, I think that's about right. And I think it's saying it's 50 degrees, and I think 49 to 50 is what I've come up with. But I ideally would have liked to push it back more if I could have for sound. That was like kind of a thing I found out by accident. I'll show you why I did this, though. I wanted 2 rows of seats. And I understood that the room was too small for 2 rows of seats, but I wanted 2 rows of seats. So I'm going to push this back here. So this was the RSP position. Oh, we got to make it. There we go. And then I got to change this because our distance is definitely more than that. It's about 74. It's going to do a waveforming analysis. It doesn't seem quite right. I think it's 122. Yeah, it's something kind of like that. And you can see roughly what we got going on. And this is roughly what I have. There's some space behind the seats, but barely any. My distance is maybe off a little bit. Anyway, so I really wanted that, and this was the only way to do it. This is actually quite a bit like what my room is like. So this is 8 inches, and this actually extends forward. That's what mine is like. And you can see I do have a problem. Although my screen is, I think, a little higher. How did that happen? Where are we looking here? Video design. Here we go. Well, I don't think I'm quite there. I moved my screen up to partially fix this problem, but that looks off. So we are going to put it at 67. There we go. Probably about correct there. And you can see that I've got this issue here where there's some, this is part of the ergonomic analysis you have to do. You have to look at this and see how the viewing is like, and if there's any heads in the way. And you can see that the top of the head of a normal sized person is in the way on the screen. And actually, the screen's a little high, other than it works well for reclining, and it probably would be better to lower it a little bit. So ideally, you would lower this down to, I think this is actually pretty close to right. And then you would raise this up. So we're getting into something else now. This really should be, let's see what 14 inches is a very common size that we would do. We would extend that forward always, and we would do 7 inch, I think at most. Let's just do just one step, call it a 12-inch step. There we go. Now we have stairs in the design. This is actually quite a bit like how mine is, except for the height. And you can see we've mostly resolved that issue. There's no longer much. You'd actually have to go even higher. The problem is this is 14 inches in a little under 10-foot tall room. So for an 8-foot ceiling height is fine, but remember that there's a projector here, right here. And that projector comes down here. So unless you're going to push the projector out of the room, you're going to have a head height clearance problem. So you would have an issue where somebody walking into the back seats could hit their head on this big giant projector hanging down. So we typically try to be really careful and avoid that. All right. Probably one of these days I should do a video kind of like this where I just go over how we design rooms, because you might find that interesting, but hopefully you found this interesting in general. So that's my video on how big screens need to be, what your viewing angles should be, and how bright they need to be. I hope you found the video helpful and interesting. Please like this video, subscribe to my channel, and please put comments below about more content you like or what you liked about this one.